Welcome to the 11th lesson of To Kill a Mockingbird, in which we'll read and discuss Chapter 17. These video lessons have been made for the grade 10 students of St. Patrick's CBC in Kimberley, South Africa. We believe strongly that all students and teachers should help one another during the coronavirus pandemic. For this reason, we've made all of our lesson materials available to the general public in the hope that we'll be helping other students and teachers to keep up with their lessons during the disruptions of lockdown and quarantine. Please subscribe to the channel and share the videos with your friends and colleagues who are studying and teaching this novel. We are going to read Chapter 17, starting on page 172 of the Heinemann edition. As we work through this chapter, take note of the details that we learn of the Yule family. We met Boris Yule on Scout's first day of school. We are now going to learn about the rest of the family. You'll also have to start thinking about your own prejudices. How do you feel about people who are different to you? And remember that prejudice isn't just about color. We might not like to admit it, but we're all prejudiced in some way or another. As you listen to Atticus's questioning, see if you can figure out what actually happened the day that Mayella says Tom raped her. If you're thinking about becoming a lawyer, here's an opportunity for you to see how a prosecutor builds a case. Atticus clearly knows what he's doing, and Jem is able to follow his line of reasoning, unlike Scout, who's too young to figure out the importance of some of Atticus's questions. Let's get started with Chapter 17. Jem, are those the Yules sitting down yonder? Hush, Mr. Hectate's testifying. Skip 2 paragraphs. In your own words, Mr. Tate, Mr. Gilmer was saying. Well, said Mr. Tate, I was called, could you say to the jury, Mr. Tate, thank you. Who called you? Well, I was fetched by Mr. Bob Yule yonder one night. What night, sir? Well, it was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Mr. Yule came in, very excited he was, and said, get out to his house quick, some man had raped his girl. Please note the use of the N-word here and how that must prejudice the jury. Did you go? Certainly. Got in the car and went out as fast as I could. And what did you find? I found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room, one on the right as you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner and said she was all right. I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson. Asked her if he beat her like that. She said yes, he had. Asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Robinson's house and brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in. That's all there was to it. Thank you, said Mr. Gilmer. Judge Taylor said, any questions, Atticus? Yes. Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anybody call a doctor? No, sir. Didn't call a doctor? No, sir. Why not? Well, I can tell you why I didn't. It wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something sure happened. It was obvious. But you didn't call a doctor. While you were there, did anyone send for one, fetch one, carry her to one? No, sir. He's answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor. I just wanted to make sure, Judge. Jem's hand, which was resting on the balcony rail, tightened around it. He drew in his breath suddenly. Glancing below, I saw no corresponding reaction and wondered if Jem was just trying to be dramatic. Dill was watching peacefully, and so was Reverend Sykes. What is it? Shh! Sheriff, You say she was mighty banged up. In what way? Well, just describe her injuries, Heck. Well, she was beaten around the head. There was already bruises coming on her arms, and it happened about 30 minutes before. How do you know? Sorry, that's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there, and she had a black eye coming. Which eye? Let's see. Can't you remember? Her left. Wait a minute, Sheriff. Was it her left facing you, or her left looking the same way you were? Oh, yes. That would make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now, she was bunged up on that side of her face. Mr. Tate blinked again, as if something had suddenly been made plain to him. Then he turned his head and looked around at Tom Robinson. As if by instinct, Tom Robinson raised his head. Something had been made plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. No. Mr. Finch, I remember now, she was bunged up on that side of the face. Which side again, Heck? The right side, Mr. Finch. But she had more bruises. You want to hear about them? Yes. What were her other injuries? As Mr. Tate answered, Atticus turned and looked at Tom Robinson, as if to say that this was something they hadn't bargained for. Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet. All around her throat? And at the back of her neck? I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch. You would? Yes, sir. She had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around it with... Just answer the question. Yes or no, please, Sheriff. Atticus sat down and nodded to the circuit solicitor, who shook his head at the judge, who nodded to Mr. Tate, who rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand. Skip a paragraph. All the spectators were as relaxed as Judge Taylor, except Jem. His mouth was twisted into a purposeful half grin, and his eyes happy about, and he said something about corroborating evidence, which made me sure he was showing off. Robert E. Lee Ewell, in answer to the clerk's booming voice, a little bantam cock of a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. When he turned around to take the oath, we saw that his face was as red as his neck. We also saw no resemblance to his namesake. A shock of wispy, new-washed hair stood up from his forehead. His nose was thin, pointed, and shiny. He had no chin to speak of. It seemed to be a part of his crepey neck. So help me God, he crowed. Your research of the Southern States and the Confederacy of the United States should have brought you to the name Robert E. Lee. He was a Confederate general, and now, 2019-2020, there has been a lot of debate in the United States about statues of Robert E. Lee, and many people want to remove those statues. In fact, some already have been removed, because it's a reminder of a very hurtful past. It's a very similar scenario to the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall movement that is in South Africa. Skip a paragraph. Maycomb Ewells lived behind the town garbage dump in what was once a black cabin. The cabin's plank walls were supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron, its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat, so only its general shape suggested its original design. Square, with 4 tiny rooms opening onto a shotgun hall. The cabin rested uneasily upon 4 irregular lumps of limestone. Its windows were merely open spaces in the walls, which in the summertime were covered with greasy strips of cheesecloth to keep out the varmints that feasted on Maycomb's refuse. Another paragraph. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Maycomb. Against the fence in a line were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they had belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson, had Miss Maudie deigned to permit a geranium on her premises. People said they were Mayella Ewells. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people said 6, others said 9. There were always several dirty-faced ones at the window when anyone passed by, and nobody had occasion to pass by except at Christmas, when the churches delivered baskets and when the mayor of Macomb asked us to please help the garbage collector by dumping our own trees and trash. Another paragraph. All the little man on the witness stand had that made him any better than his nearest neighbours was that if scrubbed with lye soap in very hot water, his skin was white. Mr. Robert Ewell, that's my name, Captain. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little, and I felt sorry for him. Turn to the next page, second paragraph. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead. Judge Taylor stirred. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Yes, sir. This is the first time you've ever been in court? I don't recall ever seeing you here. Well, let's get something straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand? Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and said, All right, Mr. Gilmer. Thank you, sir. Mr. Ewell, would you tell us, in your own words, what happened on the evening of November 21st, please? Well, the night of November 21, I was coming in from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screaming like a stuck hog inside the house. What time was it, Mr. Ewell? Just before sundown. Well, I was saying Mayella was screaming fit to beat Jesus. Yes, she was screaming. Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and run as fast as I could. But I ran into the fence, but when I got distangled, I ran up to the window and I seen... Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and pointed his finger at Tom Robinson, and he uses the most vile words that he can think of. I seen that black nigger yonder rutting on my Mayella. And of course this would have a huge effect on the courtroom. Using the N-word is bad enough, but the verb rutting is a word we use to describe animals mating. He couldn't have thought of anything more derogatory if he had tried. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dill and me, pulling at Jem's elbow. Mr. Jem, you better take Miss Jean Louise home. Mr. Jem, you hear me? Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home. You gotta make me first. I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand it. I most certainly do. I can understand anything you can. Ah, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet. Does Mr. Finch know you're here? This ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise or you boys either. Oh, he can't see us as far away. It's all right, Reverend. I knew Jem would win, because I knew nothing could make him leave now. Dill and I were safe for a while. Atticus could see us from where he was, if he looked. As Judge Taylor banged his gavel, Mr. Ewell was sitting smugly in the witness chair, surveying his handiwork. With one phrase, he had turned happy picnickers into a sulky, tense, murmuring crowd, being slowly hypnotized by gavel taps lessening in intensity, until the only sound in the courtroom was a dim pink, pink, pink. The judge might have been rapping the bench with a pencil. There has been a request, Judge Taylor said, that this courtroom be cleared of spectators, or at least of women and children, a request that will be denied for the time being. People generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for, and they have the right to subject their children to it. But I can assure you of one thing. You will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom. But you won't leave it until the whole boiling of you come before me on contempt charges. Mr. Ewell, you will keep your testimony within the confines of Christian English usage, if that's possible. Proceed, Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Gilmer and Atticus exchanged glances. Atticus was sitting down again. His fist rested on his cheek, and we couldn't see his face. Mr. Gilmer looked rather desperate. A question from Judge Taylor made him relax. Mr. Ewell, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter? Yes, I did. You say you were at the window? Yes, sir. How far is it from the ground? About 3 foot. Did you have a clear view of the room? Yes, sir. Well, how did the room look? Well, it was all slung about like there was a fight. What did you do when you saw the defendant? Well, I ran round the house to get in, but he ran out the front door just ahead of me. I sawed who he was all right. Well, I was too distracted about my yellow to run after him. I ran in the house and she was lying on the floor squalling. And then what did you do? Why, I ran for Tate quick as I could. I knowed who it was, all right. I lived down yonder in that nest, past the house every day. Judge, I've asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest down yonder. They're dangerous to live around, besides devaluing my property. Thank you, Mr. Ewell. The witness made a hasty descent from the stand and ran smack into Atticus. Just a minute, sir. Could I ask you a question or two? Mr. Ewell, folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see. You say you ran into the house. You ran to the window. You ran inside. You ran to Mayella. You ran for Mr. Tate. Did you, during all this running, run for a doctor? Oh, wasn't no need to. I seen what happened. But there's one thing I don't understand. Weren't you concerned with Mayella's condition? I most positively was. I seen who done it. No, I mean her physical condition. Did you not think the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention? What? Didn't you think she should have had a doctor immediately? The witness said he never thought of it. He'd never called a doctor to any of his in all his life. And if he had, it would have cost him $5. That all? Oh, not quite. Mr. Ewell, you heard the sheriff's testimony, didn't you? How's that? You were in the courtroom when Mr. Heck Tate was on the stand, weren't you? You heard everything he said, didn't you? Yes. Do you agree with his description of Mayella's injuries? How's that? Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened, that she was beaten. Oh, yeah, I hold with everything Tate said. You do? I just want to make sure. Atticus went to the court reporter, said something, and the reporter entertained us for some minutes by reading Mr. Tate's testimony as if it was stock market quotations. Which eye, her left? Oh, yes, that'd make her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of the face. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye. Thank you, Bert. You heard it again, Mr. Ewell. Do you have anything to add to it? Do you agree with the sheriff? I holds with Tate. Her eye was blacked and she was mighty beat up. Mr. Ewell, can you read and write? Objection. I can't see what witness's literacy has to do with the case. Irrelevant and immaterial. Judge, if you'll allow the question plus another one, you'll soon see. All right, let's see. But make sure we see, Atticus. Overruled. I'll repeat the question. Can you read and write? I most positively can. Will you write your name and show us? I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks? Mr. Ewell was endearing himself to his fellow citizens. The whispers and chuckles below us probably had to do with what a card he was. Atticus was reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out an envelope and then reached into his vest pocket and unclipped his fountain pen. He moved leisurely and had turned so that he was in full view of the jury. He unscrewed the fountain pen cap and placed it gently on his table. He shook the pen a little, then handed it with the envelope to the witness. "Would you write your name for us, clearly now, so the jury can see you do it?" Mr. Ewell wrote on the back of the envelope and looked up complacently to see Judge Taylor staring at him as if he were some fragrant gardenia in full bloom on the witness stand, to see Mr. Gilmer half sitting, half standing at his table. The jury was watching him. One man was leaning forward with his hands over the railing. "What's so interesting?" "You're left-handed, Mr. Ewell," said Judge Taylor. Mr. Ewell turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what his being left-handed had to do with it, that he was a Christ-fearing man and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. Tricking lawyers like Atticus Finch took advantage of him all the time with their tricking ways. He had told them what happened, he'd say it again and again, which he did. Nothing Atticus asked him after that shook his story. That he'd look through the window, then run Tom off, then run for the sheriff. Atticus finally dismissed him. Mr. Gilmer asked him one more question. "About your writing with your left hand, are you ambidextrous, Mr. Ewell?" "I most positively am not. I can use one hand good as the other. One hand good as the other." Jem seemed to be having a quiet fit. He was pounding the balcony rails softly, and once he whispered, "We've got him." I didn't think so. Atticus was trying to show, it seemed to me, that Mr. Ewell could have beaten up Mayella. That much I could follow. If her right eye was blacked and she was beaten mostly on the right side of the face, it would tend to show that a left-handed person did it. Sherlock Holmes and Jem Finch would agree. But Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too. Like Mr. Tate, I imagined a person facing me, went through a swift mental pantomime and concluded that he might have held her with his right hand and pounded her with his left. I looked at him. His back was to us, but I could see his broad shoulders and his bull-thick neck, or he could easily have done it. I thought Jem was counting his chickens. As we learn about the Ewell circumstances, it seems obvious that the father, Bob Ewell, is a disreputable, dishonest man. Surely this will count against him, or is his whiteness a shield that he can use in his favor? Many of you will have heard the term white privilege. This is an example of that. Bob is a liar. He's a terrible father. Yet he will be treated more kindly and compassionately by Mr. Gilmer and the jury, simply because of the color of his skin. Atticus is a brilliant lawyer. It becomes obvious to us why Judge Taylor assigned this case to Atticus. As readers, the building of the case against Mayella leads us to believe that Tom has a real chance to get the charges against him dropped. But this is the United States, in the Deep South, in the 1930s. Realistically, what are Tom's chances of receiving a fair trial? Instead of review questions, I'd like you to put on your lawyer's robes and start completing these 2 pages of notes about the trial. This is such an important section of the novel, and you should prepare yourselves for an essay question based on the trial. Yes, that is a hot tip for the end-of-year exams. Thank you for joining me for this lesson. Work hard. The trial is possibly the most important part of the novel. Make sure that you understand the content and that you've thought deeply about all of these issues. Until the next lesson, keep safe by wearing your masks, sanitizing your hands, and maintaining those social distances. Goodbye.